The Arizona sun was already high, turning the dust of the military training base into a shimmering haze. Rows of wooden shooting benches stretched across the open range, their metal rests hot to the touch. The smell of spent gunpowder from the morning's drills hung in the air, mingling with the faint tang of oil from the freshly cleaned weapons. Emma Carter stood near the far end of the line, her long brown hair tied back in a low knot that kept it out of her sharp blue-gray eyes. She wore a faded olive-green military shirt, its fabric softened by years of wear, tucked into weathered tactical pants. Her black boots were scuffed but polished enough to show she cared for them. She didn't look like the others. Most of the students were younger, lean with the energy of fresh recruits. A handful of veterans were scattered among them, carrying themselves with the easy familiarity of men and women who had seen their share of deployments. Emma, at 32, didn't fit neatly into either group. She had arrived early that morning, well before roll call, helping the staff arrange the shooting benches, straighten the practice mats, and clear away stray shell casings left from the day before. No one had asked her to do any of it. She simply worked quietly, without comment, while the others stood in clusters talking about rifles, deployment stories, or weekend plans. Now on the range, the instructor, a tall man with a gruff expression and the kind of voice that carried without effort, walked down the line handing out weapons for the day's first drill. When he reached Emma, he paused, holding out an M4 rifle. "This one's for you," he said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. She took the rifle without hesitation. Her fingers brushed the magazine release, feeling the telltale stiffness. The barrel was slightly scuffed, and when she looked down the scope, she noticed it was angled off, misaligned enough to send shots wide. A quick test of the charging handle told her the action was jammed. From somewhere to her left, a young soldier's voice drifted over, pitched just loud enough to be overheard. "This is gonna be good." A couple of quiet laughs followed. Emma didn't respond. She simply looked over the weapon with the same calm precision she might have used to inspect a tool before a job. The drill began with a sharp command. One by one, each student fired in turn, the cracks of gunfire echoing across the flat expanse. When Emma's turn came, she lifted the rifle, aligning the faulty scope with the target 300 meters away. She squeezed the trigger. The first shot went wide by several centimeters. There were chuckles and a low whistle from the group behind her. The instructor stood with his arms folded, watching. Emma lowered the rifle, cleared the chamber, and began breaking it down without a word. She moved quickly but without rushing, removing the magazine, checking the chamber, sliding the bolt carrier group free, and inspecting the parts for debris. A thin smear of residue near the gas key caught her attention. She cleaned it away with a cloth from her pocket. When she reassembled the rifle, she didn't test it again. Instead, she set it back on the rack and stepped aside for the next shooter. The instructor's expression carried a flicker of satisfaction, as if he had proven something to himself. The murmurs from the other students continued, a mixture of amusement and the smug certainty of people who believed they had just seen confirmation of their assumptions. But not everyone saw it that way. From the far end of the benches, an older veteran, broad-shouldered, with a sun-weathered face and eyes that had the weight of experience, had been watching closely. He'd noticed the way Emma's fingers moved over the weapon, the efficiency of her breakdown, the speed with which she'd identified the problem areas. That wasn't the fumbling of someone unfamiliar with a rifle. That was muscle memory. He didn't say anything. Not yet. Later, when the drills ended and the others filed out toward the mess hall, Emma remained behind. The range was quieter now, the sound of gunfire replaced by the hum of the wind moving through the desert brush. She walked over to the repair pile near the armory, a collection of rifles with bent sights, worn springs, or other defects that made them unreliable. Picking one up, she inspected it, adjusted the stock, and fired at a distant target. The shots weren't perfect, but they landed closer than most people could manage with flawless equipment. The janitor, sweeping brass casings into a bin, paused to watch her. Most people complained about faulty gear. She didn't. She just kept working with it until it did what she wanted. That first evening set a pattern. Every day after formal training, Emma stayed behind, choosing weapons others had discarded as unfit for use. She practiced with them until she knew exactly how each one failed, memorizing the quirks of their aim, the drag in their triggers, the way a bent barrel shifted the point of impact. She didn't announce what she was doing. She didn't seem to care if anyone noticed. What she cared about was control, knowing that when she pulled a trigger, the result wouldn't surprise her, no matter how flawed the weapon was. By the second day, the whispers about her had grown. What's she doing here? Looks more like a librarian than a soldier. This isn't a hobby class. Bet she learned that from movies. Emma never replied. She kept her focus on the range, her stance steady, her breathing controlled, her trigger discipline exact. When the next set of drills began, the instructor again placed a weapon in her hands, a different one this time, but with its own share of problems. Emma took it without comment, adjusted for the imperfections, and fired. Her shots landed clean, not perfect, but close enough to silence at least some of the smirks. The young soldier, who had mocked her earlier, kept his voice lower now. The desert light was fading when she finally left the range that night. Her boots left a trail of faint prints in the dust, the last ones before the wind began smoothing them away. The broken M4 sat on the rack where she had left it, still misaligned, still jam-prone. But Emma had already decided she would take it again if it came her way. If someone thought it was a weapon meant to embarrass her, they didn't understand. She had spent years making the unreliable work, and she knew something the others didn't. Perfection in equipment was a luxury. Out here, and in the places that had shaped her long before this range, you didn't wait for perfect. You learned to adapt. And Emma Carter had built her life on adaptation. Morning came with the same relentless heat, the kind that made the metal benches too hot to lean against and the air shimmer in waves above the ground. The Arizona training base was awake early, its usual symphony of boot steps, shouted commands, and the rhythmic clatter of rifles being checked and rechecked. Emma Carter was there before most of the others, as usual. She moved quietly among the practice stations, straightening paper targets, aligning the wooden benches so they sat square with the lanes, and gathering the brass casings that glinted in the dust. Her movements were efficient, deliberate, and without fuss. She didn't seem to notice, or care, that no one else was helping. The younger soldiers arrived in groups, their conversations spilling into the air. Some glanced her way, curiosity and skepticism mixing in their eyes. They didn't know her background, and Emma wasn't in the habit of offering it. To them, she was simply the woman in worn gear who spent too much time alone at the range. The second day's drills involved adapting to unfamiliar weapons. Each trainee was handed a rifle or carbine, sometimes in pristine condition, sometimes with quirks or defects. The idea was to see who could adjust quickly, who could adapt without wasting shots. When the instructor came to Emma, he paused again. His gaze flicked over her face, then down to the weapon he held, a different M4, though not much better than the one from the day before. The stock was loose, the scope off-center, and the trigger had an unpredictable break. "Try this one," he said, the faintest hint of challenge in his tone. Emma accepted the rifle without comment, cradling it in her hands like a puzzle to be solved. She didn't fire right away. Instead, she made small adjustments, feeling the weapon's balance, noting the tension in the trigger, and memorizing the skew of the scope. The line went quiet when the drill began. Trainees fired one after another, the steady rhythm of shots echoing across the desert. When Emma's turn came, she moved into position with smooth precision. She fired her first shot. It landed slightly off the center mark. She nodded once, as if confirming something to herself, then adjusted her aim by a fraction. The next shots landed closer. They weren't perfect, not yet, but they were consistent. The murmurs began again, softer this time. The same young soldier from the day before watched her closely. His smirk faded into something closer to curiosity. When the drill ended, most of the group drifted toward the mess hall, eager for the respite of shade. Emma stayed behind. She walked to the repair rack, where weapons with known defects waited for maintenance. She selected one with a bent barrel and sat at the far bench, field stripping it under the sun. Her hands moved with an easy confidence, each motion purposeful. She tested the bolt, listened to the click of the trigger, adjusted the sights even though she knew the bend in the barrel made perfect accuracy impossible. She wasn't chasing perfection. She was learning the weapon's language. From the edge of the range, the older veteran, broad-shouldered, quiet, watched again. He noticed how she checked each part twice, not out of doubt but from ingrained habit. Her focus was absolute, the world narrowing to the weight of the rifle in her hands and the target in the distance. The janitor passed by with a broom, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "Most folks just toss those back and wait for the armorer to fix him," he remarked. "You're the first I've seen who tries to make em work as they are." Emma looked up briefly, a small smile touching her lips. "Sometimes you don't get the fixed ones," she said. She stayed on the range until the shadows stretched long, and the sky took on the first hint of gold. Her target showed the story, shots grouping tighter and tighter, even with a rifle that should have been a liability. By the end of the week, others had started to notice. Not just her accuracy, but the way she carried herself. She didn't boast, didn't seek attention, but when she spoke about technique, her advice was clear and precise. A younger recruit approached her quietly one afternoon, asking how to adjust a stock to reduce recoil. She showed him without condescension, explaining each step until he understood. Still, whispers followed her. Some dismissed her as lucky. Others guessed she'd had some basic training, but nothing serious. But a few, just a few, were beginning to think there was more to Emma Carter than she let on. Late one afternoon, after most had left, the sound of footsteps approached from behind her firing lane. She glanced over her shoulder to see a tall man in a desert camouflage cap, his posture straight, his eyes sharp. Colonel Marcus Grant. He was a retired Ranger officer, a man whose reputation alone carried weight. Word was, he had commanded units in some of the most dangerous operations overseas. Now he served as a guest instructor, dropping in unannounced to observe and offer corrections. Grant stopped a few feet from Emma and watched her fire a sequence at the 400-meter target. The weapon she was using, a battered M4 with a stiff trigger, kicked slightly in her hands, but each shot landed in nearly the same place. He didn't say a word, only gave a slow nod before moving down the line to watch someone else. Emma said nothing either, but her eyes followed him briefly. She recognized the way he looked at people, not scanning for form alone, but for something deeper, something learned. That night, as the sky turned to a deep indigo, Emma stood at the edge of the range, her rifle at rest by her side. She could still hear the echo of the day's shots in her mind, feel the heat of the barrel cooling in her hands. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here for something far older, far heavier than this course. Something she carried alone. And soon, though she didn't yet know it, Colonel Grant was going to understand exactly what that was. The next week began with an unusual tension in the air. Word had spread that Colonel Marcus Grant would be spending more time at the range, observing the advanced course. For most of the trainees, his presence was a source of nerves. A Ranger commander with his record didn't just hand out casual feedback. If he spoke to you, it meant he had noticed something, for better or worse. Emma Carter showed no sign of being unsettled. She arrived as she always did, early enough to watch the sunrise lift over the desert hills. She set out fresh targets, tightened bolts on the shooting benches, and swept away the dust that the night wind had carried in. Her movements were unhurried but purposeful, the same quiet rhythm that had defined her every day here. Grant arrived mid-morning, moving down the line with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He stopped at each lane, watching a few shots, asking brief questions, offering a correction or two. His voice was even, his comments precise. He didn't waste words. When he reached Emma's position, he lingered longer than he had anywhere else. She was sighting in a rifle that most had avoided, a weapon with a scope so far off alignment that a clean shot required constant mental compensation. She fired. The sound cracked sharply, echoing off the low hills. Grant's eyes followed the impact on the target, then shifted back to her stance. He watched her fire again, her breathing steady, her finger disciplined on the trigger. 6 shots in under 30 seconds, all inside a grouping so tight it might have been fired from half the distance. Grant said nothing, only gave the faintest nod and moved on. But his mind was working. He had seen shooters with skill, but this was different. This wasn't just good aim. This was adaptation so ingrained it was almost instinctive. Later that day, during a break, the older veteran who had been quietly watching Emma since the first drill walked up to Grant. He leaned close enough to keep his words from carrying. "I think she was with Daniel Reed," he murmured. Grant froze for a fraction of a second. The name was one he hadn't heard in years. Daniel Reed, legendary among certain circles, a sniper who had led an impossible defense in Fallujah before being killed in action. Grant's eyes drifted across the range to where Emma was sitting on a bench, cleaning her rifle. Her movements were exact, almost meditative. That evening, after the course had ended for the day, Grant stayed behind. He saw Emma walking slowly across the gravel lot toward the road that led out of the base. Instead of heading straight for the barracks, she turned toward the small veterans' cemetery nearby. The desert wind tugged lightly at her shirt as she stepped between the headstones. She stopped at one in particular, a simple granite marker engraved with the name Sergeant Daniel Reed. She knelt, reached into her pocket, and placed a single spent bullet casing at its base. Grant didn't move from where he stood a few rows back. He kept his cap in his hand, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. The memory clicked into place, like a round sliding into a chamber. He remembered the after-action reports. The descriptions of a sniper holding a defensive position with a damaged rifle while her unit withdrew under fire. 8 soldiers had made it out alive that day. The shooter-spotter, Daniel Reed, had not, and the shooter herself had left the service shortly afterward, disappearing quietly without ceremony or public recognition. The reports had never named her. But now, watching her kneel at Reed's grave, Grant knew. The next day, Grant positioned himself near her lane during the afternoon drills. She was working with the same broken M4 from the first week, the one with the bent barrel and scope misalignment so severe most shooters wouldn't waste ammunition on it. 400 meters, Grant said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Emma set her stance, checked the wind, and adjusted her aim, not with the scope, but with subtle corrections in her posture and sight picture. She fired 6 shots in rapid succession. Through the spotting scope, Grant watched each one strike within a centimeter of the others, all in the kill zone. He exhaled slowly. This wasn't guesswork. This was calculation in motion. When the drill ended, the younger trainees clustered in small groups, swapping comments and half-joking about impossible shots. But more than a few kept glancing toward Emma now, their expressions shifting from dismissal to something closer to respect. That night, Grant walked the length of the quiet range, the targets ghostly in the dim light. He thought of the stories he'd heard from Fallujah, the chaos of urban combat, the way a single position could become the difference between survival and loss. He thought of Daniel Reed and the unnamed sniper who had made sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. It was no longer just a suspicion. He knew exactly who Emma Carter was. And though he had the authority to make that knowledge public, he decided against it. Some stories belonged only to the people who had lived them. For now he would watch. And when the moment came, he would make sure the others understood exactly who they were training beside. Emma, as always, didn't seem to care what anyone thought. She kept coming early, kept choosing the broken rifles, kept working with them until they behaved the way she wanted. But the difference now was subtle. When she stepped to the firing line, there were fewer smirks, fewer whispers. People were starting to realize that she wasn't there to prove anything to them. She was there for reasons they didn't yet understand. And soon they would. The final week of the course came with a shift in the air, like the quiet before a storm. The trainees knew the last evaluation would be different from the usual drills. This was the moment that decided whether you passed the advanced course or walked away with nothing more than a bruised ego. Colonel Marcus Grant stood at the head of the range, clipboard under his arm, his voice steady as he explained the rules. "Each of you will fire 6 rounds, he said, his eyes sweeping the line of trainees. "The weapon you receive will be assigned at random. You'll have 40 seconds to complete your shots. Targets are set at 300 meters. Accuracy matters more than speed, but you'll need both. There will be no retakes." The students nodded, a few swallowing hard. The stakes weren't life and death, but you could feel the pressure tightening every stance, sharpening every breath. Emma Carter waited at the far end, her face unreadable. She'd been through hundreds of shooting drills, but her focus never changed. She listened to Grant's instructions, without shifting her weight or glancing at the others. One by one, the trainees were called forward. Rifles were handed out, some new, some well-worn, a few with quirks only the armorers knew. Shots rang out in quick bursts, echoing against the low hills, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the warm air. Then it was Emma's turn. The instructor approached, holding a familiar weapon, the battered M4 from the first week. Its barrel still slightly bent, the scope still misaligned, the trigger still prone to sticking. It was the same rifle she had been given on her first day. Deliberately, it seemed, to test her. A murmur passed down the line. A young private near the middle smirked and muttered, "This should be entertaining." His voice was low, but Grant heard it. Emma accepted the rifle without a flicker of emotion. She didn't complain, didn't glance at the instructor as if to question his choice. She simply stepped to the firing line and checked the weapon. Her fingers moved with quiet certainty, adjusting the stock, testing the trigger pull, gauging the resistance. She tilted her head slightly, letting her eyes sweep the length of the barrel and noting the imperfections she already knew by heart. Then she glanced at the range flags, estimating the crosswind. When Grant gave the signal, she brought the rifle to her shoulder. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. The first shot cracked into the still air. Then another. Then another. Her pace was fast but measured, each squeeze of the trigger smooth and consistent. She didn't pause to re-aim between shots. She didn't need to. Her adjustments had already accounted for the rifle's faults, the wind's push, the way the bent barrel shifted the trajectory. 40 seconds later, the last shot echoed into silence. The range was still. Even the usual murmurs had stopped. Grant walked to the target himself, his boots crunching on the gravel. When he reached it, he stared for a long moment before turning back. There was no spread, no scatter. All 6 bullets had passed through the same point, the hole so perfectly round it looked like a single shot. Someone whispered, "That's not possible." Grant's voice carried clearly across the range. "It's possible. I've seen it before once. In Fallujah." Every head turned toward him. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Back in 2007, during a street engagement in the city, a ranger unit was pinned under heavy fire. The only cover was a damaged rooftop. Their sniper's rifle, a rifle just like that one, was compromised. The barrel had been bent by shrapnel. The scope was useless. And still, that sniper neutralized 8 targets in under a minute, giving the team a way out. They all made it home except one, her spotter, Sergeant Daniel Reed. He stayed behind so the others could escape. The silence deepened. Grant looked directly at Emma. "That sniper," he said, "was her." A ripple moved through the group, shock, disbelief, and something else, respect. They had spent weeks underestimating her, not realizing they were training beside someone who had done what most of them couldn't imagine. A young trainee broke the quiet. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Emma lowered the rifle and rested it gently on the bench. Her voice, when it came, was calm but firm. "Because talking about it doesn't save lives. Training does. I made a promise that day, and I keep it by staying ready." Grant nodded once, his gaze steady. He didn't add anything more. Some truths didn't need to be dressed up with speeches. One by one, the trainees approached her, not with the casual nods or half-smiles they'd given before, but with handshakes and quiet words of respect. Even the young private who had mocked her earlier stood in front of her, looking awkward. "I misjudged you," he admitted. Emma's reply was simple. "Don't judge anyone until you know what they've carried." The rest of the evaluation continued, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Where there had once been whispers and doubt, there was now a quiet understanding. For Emma, it wasn't about proving herself. She hadn't come here for recognition. She had come for the same reason she stayed late every night, practicing with broken rifles, because one day, someone might need her to do it again. And if that day came, she intended to be ready. The last day of the course arrived with an early desert breeze, cool enough to make the sand shift in tiny eddies across the gravel walkways. The trainees gathered for the informal farewell, a table of paperwork, a few mugs of coffee going cold in the sun, and the stack of certificates for those who had met the standard. Emma Carter stood near the edge of the group, her hands resting lightly on the strap of her rifle bag. She listened politely to the chatter, but didn't contribute. For her, the course had never been about a piece of paper or a title. Colonel Marcus, Grant moved through the crowd with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He stopped at Emma's side and held out a small, sealed envelope. "This came from Sergeant Daniel Reed's family," he said. "They've been waiting years for the right time to pass it on." Emma accepted it without opening it. Her fingers closed around the envelope gently, as if it were something fragile. She gave a single nod, no more, and slipped it into the inner pocket of her jacket. The rest of the group lined up to shake hands with the instructors, some already speaking about their next assignments. When Emma's turn came, the range instructor, the same man who had handed her the broken rifle on the first day, looked her in the eye. His expression held more than formality. There was a trace of regret. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "You don't owe me anything," Emma replied, her voice even. "Just maybe don't decide what someone can do based on how they look." He gave a small, respectful nod. When the goodbyes were done, the group began to break apart. Vehicles started up, engines growling as the trainees headed toward the main road. Soon the range was empty except for Emma. She walked back to the firing line, unzipped her rifle bag, and pulled out the battered M4. It still bore the same bent barrel, the same stubborn scope, the same quirks she had learned to work with. She loaded 6 rounds, took her position, and breathed in slowly. The shots came in steady rhythm, the sound carrying over the quiet range. When she walked forward to check the target, there it was, 6 rounds through the same single hole, a perfect circle. She lowered the rifle, looking at the target for a long moment. "Still here, Daniel," she said softly. The sun was lowering, spilling gold and red light across the distant hills. Emma reloaded the rifle, then fired again, her movements as smooth as if she were on a battlefield and not standing alone in the Arizona dust. She wasn't competing with anyone, wasn't proving anything, just keeping her promise. She knew she would never stop practicing. The promise she had made to Daniel on that rooftop in Fallujah wasn't about glory. It was about readiness, about making sure that if the day ever came again when someone needed her skills, she wouldn't have lost them to time or neglect. In the weeks that followed, the story began to spread, not as gossip, but as something quieter, more respectful. Other women in the service heard about her and found encouragement in her example. One young sniper trainee, frustrated with the quirks of an old rifle, remembered the words her instructor passed along. "Perfect equipment doesn't make perfect soldiers. Perfect soldiers make any equipment work." Back at the Arizona range, the battered M4 was never sent off for disposal. The instructor kept it on the rack as a reminder, not of failure, but of what determination could do. Trainees would point to it and whisper about the day a quiet woman with calm eyes had turned it into something unstoppable. Emma returned to her life outside the base with no fanfare. She didn't hang the certificate on her wall. She didn't tell her neighbors what she had done. But every so often, she'd take out the envelope from Daniel's family, run her fingers over the worn paper, and place it back in the small wooden box that held her unit photo and a few mementos from that day in Fallujah. Some stories, she knew, didn't belong in headlines. They belonged in the hearts of the people who had lived them. When she thought about the broken rifle, she didn't see a flaw anymore. She saw a truth that had carried her through every hard moment of her life. Skill is born from adaptation, not perfection. Challenges aren't there to break you. They're there to show you what you can build, even from pieces that don't seem to fit. For anyone else, it might have just been an old, damaged weapon. For Emma, it was proof that the strongest people often look nothing like what you expect, and that the quietest ones in the room are sometimes carrying the heaviest stories. And so, every time she stepped onto a range, she carried that weight not as a burden, but as a promise kept.